You know how sometimes the biggest news stories, the ones that actually change the way the world works, do not start with a bang. They do not start with a press conference where everyone is shouting or a breaking news banner that takes up the entire screen. Sometimes the most significant shifts in power, the moments where you can actually hear the gears of history grinding against each other, start with something incredibly small, something mundane, something you might not even notice if you were walking down the aisle of your local grocery store. Tonight, I want to talk to you about a steak. Just a regular vacuum-sealed package of beef that was supposed to cross a border, just like millions of pounds of beef do every single day. It was supposed to go from a processing plant here in the United States, get loaded onto a truck, drive north, cross the line into Canada, and end up on a dinner table in Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal. That is the way it works. That is the way it has worked for decades. The logistical miracle of North American trade is so efficient, so invisible, that we take it for granted until the moment it stops. And right now, it has stopped. But this story is not really about beef. I mean, it is, but it is also about something much larger. It is about what happens when the invisible lines that hold the global economy together get snapped. It is about what happens when a political leader, in this case, the President of the United States, finds out that the leverage he thought he had, the power he thought was absolute, might actually have a limit. We are seeing reports now, ripples really, that are turning into waves that United States beef exports are being turned away at the Canadian border, rejected, sent back. And the reaction from the White House, the reaction from Donald Trump, has been described in reporting as furious, speechless. Now, we have seen Donald Trump angry before. We have seen him lashing out on social media. We have seen the rallies. We know what that looks like. But speechless is different. Silence in this administration usually means something has gone wrong in a way that was not in the script. It means the usual tools, the bluster, the threats, the tariffs are not working the way they are supposed to. To understand why this is happening and why this specific rejection of American agriculture is causing such a meltdown in the Oval Office, we have to look at the machinery of how we got here. We have to look at the promises that were made about trade, about America first, and about how the rest of the world was supposed to bow down to American economic might. The theory of the case for this administration has always been that the United States is the sun and every other economy is just a planet orbiting around us, dependent on our gravity, dependent on our warmth. The idea was that we could dictate terms. We could demand concessions. We could say, you will buy our products, you will lower your barriers, you will do what we say or else. And for a long time, that threat, that or else, was enough to keep the system moving, or at least to keep the appearance of a win. But what happens when a trading partner, even a close ally like Canada, decides to call the bluff? What happens when they look at the political chaos here? They look at the demands being made and they simply say no. This rejection of U.S. beef is a signal. It is a signal that the old rules of engagement are fracturing. And it is critical to understand that this did not happen overnight. This is not just about one shipment or one safety inspector having a bad day. This is the culmination of years of tension, years of chipping away at the institutions and the agreements that were built to prevent exactly this kind of trade war. We are talking about supply chains that took decades to build, relationships between farmers in Nebraska and buyers in Ontario that go back generations. When you disrupt that, when you throw a wrench into that complex, delicate machine, you do not just lose a sale. You lose trust. You lose reliability. And once that is gone, it is incredibly hard to get it back. The reporting we are seeing suggests that this move by Canada is precise. It is targeted. It is not a flailing reaction. It is a calculated strategic move designed to hit a specific political pressure point. And judging by the reaction from the president, judging by the silence and then the fury, it hit the mark. We need to talk about the timing of this. We are in a moment where the American economy is already fragile, where inflation has been a headline concern for years, where farmers are already operating on razor-thin margins. The agricultural sector in this country is a massive political constituency. It is a pillar of the economy in states that are absolutely essential for any political coalition. And they were told, they were promised that this administration would fight for them. They were told that the trade wars were going to be easy to win. They were told that the toughness of the president would result in better deals, more exports, more money in their pockets. So when the opposite happens, when the borders close and the product sits rotting in trucks or gets turned around, that is a betrayal of the central promise of this presidency. That is why the silence is so loud. That is why the fury is so palpable. Because it is not just about the beef. It is about the failure of a worldview. It is about the sudden, stark realization that in a global economy, you cannot simply command the tides to turn. And here's the thing that makes this even more complicated. Canada is not just some distant adversary. They are our neighbor. They are our biggest trading partner. We share a continent. We share an integrated energy grid. We share an auto industry. The economies of the United States and Canada are like Siamese twins. You cannot separate them without causing massive trauma to both. So when you start seeing these kinds of rejections, these kinds of hard stops at the border, it is dangerous. It is dangerous for the economy, sure, but it is also dangerous for the stability of the entire North American project. We are used to thinking of the border as a line on a map, a place where you show your passport and maybe answer a few questions. But economically, that border is a membrane. It is supposed to let things flow through. When it hardens, when it becomes a wall, literally or bureaucratically, the pressure starts to build up on both sides. And right now, the pressure is building up in the White House, and it is building up in the feedlots of the Midwest, and it is building up in the boardrooms where people are looking at the spreadsheets and realizing that the math does not work anymore. So, what exactly triggered this? What was the specific spark that led Canada to say no more to U.S. beef? To answer that, we have to dig a little bit into the weeds of trade policy, into the technical details that usually make people's eyes glaze over. But stick with me, because this is where the story actually lives. It is not in the tweets. It is not in the campaign rallies. It is in the regulations, the health standards, the obscure clauses in trade agreements that nobody reads until everything goes wrong. It appears that this dispute is rooted in a conflict over standards, over what we put in our food and what the rest of the world is willing to accept. But it is also about reciprocity. It is about the feeling growing among our allies that the United States has become an unreliable partner, a partner that changes the rules in the middle of the game. And when you are dealing with something as fundamental as food safety, as fundamental as the supply chain that feeds a nation, you cannot afford uncertainty. You cannot afford to wonder if the partner on the other side of the handshake is going to pull a fast one. Here's the thing about international trade wars. They rarely start with a declaration of war. They start with paperwork. They start with a sudden, unexplained strictness about rules that everyone used to ignore. And that appears to be exactly what happened here. According to reports circulating in agricultural circles and now breaking into the wider press, Canadian border inspectors quietly, methodically, began rejecting shipments of American beef on technical grounds. We are talking about thousands of tons of product. The official reason given, the bureaucratic excuse on the forms, likely has to do with specific additives or hormone residue levels, the kind of non-tariff barrier that trade lawyers spend their entire careers arguing about. But nobody, and I mean nobody, thinks this is actually about food safety. If this beef was safe enough to eat in Chicago last week, it is safe enough to eat in Toronto this week. The science did not change, the politics did. This rejection is the official act. It is the lever that Canada just pulled. But to understand the fury coming from the White House, to understand why Donald Trump is reportedly speechless and seething, you have to look at the buildup. You have to look at the gamble the president took. Go back to the beginning of this term. One of the central pillars of the Trump economic agenda was the imposition of sweeping tariffs, a universal baseline tariff on all imports, including those from our closest allies. The logic, if you can call it that, was blunt force trauma. The idea was that if we tax their goods, they will be so desperate for access to the American consumer market that they will come to the table on their knees, begging to give us whatever concessions we want. It was supposed to be a shakedown. Nice economy you got there. Shame if something happened to it. And for a while, the administration operated as if this was a foregone conclusion. They announced the tariffs. They threatened the duties on Canadian steel, on aluminum, on lumber, the greatest hits of the trade war playlist. And the assumption in Washington, certainly the assumption in the West Wing, was that Canada would blink. The assumption was that they are too small, too dependent, too polite to fight back. But that is the thing about assumptions. They are dangerous when they replace intelligence. While the White House was busy posturing, Canada was busy preparing. They were not just sitting around waiting to be bullied. They were mapping out the U.S. economy, identifying the pressure points, and figuring out exactly where to squeeze to cause the maximum amount of political pain with the minimum amount of collateral damage to themselves. This is how the system works. When you are the smaller fighter in the ring, you do not try to trade punches with the giant. You go for the knees. And the American beef industry is a very big, very sensitive knee. By rejecting these exports, Canada is doing two things simultaneously. First, they are protecting their own domestic market, encouraging their consumers to buy Canadian, a sentiment that has been growing rapidly north of the border as these tensions have escalated. We have seen reports of Canadians actively boycotting American products, checking labels, and choosing local options as a form of civic duty. But secondly, and more importantly, they are sending a shockwave directly into the American heartland, into the red states that make up the president's base. Think about the incentives here. If you are the Prime Minister of Canada or the trade ministers advising him, you know that Donald Trump does not care about a sternly worded letter from the UN. He cares about his poll numbers in Iowa. He cares about what they are saying on the talk radio stations in Nebraska. So you target the commodities that are produced in those specific places. You target corn, you target beef, you target the very people who voted for the America First agenda, and you force them to pick up the tab for it. It is a ruthless, calculated strategy of asymmetric economic warfare. And the reason the president is furious is not just that it is happening, it is that it is working. The silence we are hearing, that unusual lack of immediate, blustering counterattack, suggests that the administration realizes they have walked into a trap of their own making. They levied the tariffs expecting capitulation. Instead, they got a mirror held up to their own vulnerabilities. And who benefits from this? Well, in the short term, nobody. That is the tragedy of a trade war. American ranchers are losing millions of dollars a day in spoiled inventory and lost contracts. Canadian consumers might pay a little more for a steak or have fewer options at the grocery store. But in the cold calculus of geopolitical power, Canada is winning something valuable here: credibility. They are proving that the cost of bullying them is higher than the benefit. Meanwhile, other global players are watching. We are seeing reports that countries like Australia and New Zealand are stepping in to fill the void, happily selling their beef to markets that the U.S. is being shut out of. The market share that American companies spent decades building is evaporating, perhaps permanently. And that is the part that is hardest to fix. You can repeal a tariff with a signature. You cannot sign a piece of paper that makes a foreign buyer trust you again. This is the part of the story where the rubber meets the road. Or more accurately, where the rubber meets the turnaround lane at the border crossing. Because while the headlines are about presidents and prime ministers, the reality is about panic in the boardrooms of the American beef industry. We are talking about the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the powerful lobby groups that practically live in the hallways of Congress, suddenly realizing that their access to the White House isn't saving them. In fact, their closeness to this administration is arguably what put a target on their backs. The phone lines in Washington have been melting down. You have lobbyists who are used to writing the rules suddenly begging for a lifeline because the strategy they signed off on, the strategy of aggression and dominance, has backfired in the most expensive way possible. And to understand why the panic is so acute, you have to understand the specific physics of the meat industry. This isn't steel. If you put a tariff on steel, or if a shipment of aluminum gets held up at the border for a week, it sits there. It is annoying, it costs money in storage fees, but the steel doesn't go bad. It doesn't spoil. Beef is different. Beef is a ticking clock. The entire industry is built on a just-in-time supply chain that is calibrated down to the hour. The cattle are fed to reach a specific weight at a specific time. They are processed on a schedule that assumes the product will move immediately into the cold chain: refrigerated trucks, distribution centers, grocery shelves. There is no pause button on a cow. When that truck gets turned around at the Canadian border, you cannot just put the product back in the warehouse and wait for the politics to settle down. You have a perishable asset that is rapidly losing value every single second it isn't moving toward a consumer. So when Canada rejects these shipments, they aren't just delaying trade. They are destroying capital. They are forcing American producers to dump that product back onto the domestic market. And here is the basic economics lesson that is giving the White House heartburn. When you suddenly flood the U.S. market with all this beef that was supposed to go to Canada, the supply skyrockets and the price collapses. Domestic beef prices drop. That might sound great if you are buying a burger tonight, but if you are a rancher in Montana or South Dakota operating on thin margins, a price collapse is a death sentence. It wipes out your profit for the year. It puts your farm loan in default. It bankrupts the very people who were wearing the Make America Great Again hats at the rallies. And this brings us back to the president's silence. Why is he speechless? Because he is watching a constituency that he considers the rural agricultural base, getting hammered by the consequences of his own policy. And he can't blame the fake news for this. He can't blame the Democrats. The ranchers know exactly who started this fight. They know that this is the direct retaliation for the tariffs the president imposed or threatened. It is a cause and effect loop that is so tight, so undeniable, that it leaves no room for spin. The reporting suggests that inside the West Wing, there is a scramble to find a way out, to find some leverage, some counter threat. But the problem is Canada has already priced that in. They knew the U.S. would get angry. They just calculated that the U.S. would get hurt faster than it could get angry enough to do something about it. It is also important to look at the accountability here. Who is actually making these decisions on the Canadian side? It is not just a faceless bureaucracy. This is the government of Justin Trudeau, a government that this White House has repeatedly insulted, belittled, and underestimated. There is a personal dynamic here that cannot be ignored. For years, the Trump administration has treated the U.S.-Canada relationship as a master-servant dynamic. They have assumed that Canada has no choice but to take whatever deal is offered. But by targeting the beef sector, the Trudeau government is demonstrating a level of political sophistication that the Trump team apparently didn't see coming. They are saying, we might be smaller, but we know where you live, politically speaking. This is the nightmare scenario for any populist leader, when the strongman act stops looking like strength and starts looking like liability. When the tough talk results in your own supporters losing their livelihoods, the spell starts to break. And that is what we are seeing in the silence from the president. It is the silence of a man who realizes he has overplayed his hand, and the person sitting across the poker table, the polite, quiet neighbor, just laid down a royal flush. The question now is not whether the U.S. will retaliate further. The question is whether the U.S. agriculture industry will let them. Because right now, the most dangerous noise in Washington isn't the shouting from the president, it is the angry phone calls coming from inside the House. And this is where we have to talk about the weapon itself. Because what Canada is doing here is actually much more sophisticated than just a tit-for-tat tariff. If the United States puts a tax on Canadian lumber, that is a number. It is visible. You can argue about whether the number is fair. But what Canada is doing with this beef is using what economists call a non-tariff barrier. They are using the bureaucracy of health and safety regulations as a shield and a sword. It is the ultimate passive-aggressive geopolitical move. They aren't saying, we hate American beef. They are saying, oh, we would love to take your beef. Really, we would. But our inspectors just found this tiny technical issue with the paperwork or this microscopic trace of an additive that doesn't meet our very high standards. So sorry. It is maddeningly effective because it is almost impossible to fight in a court of public opinion. How do you rally a base against a health inspector in Ottawa doing their job? How do you tweet against a food safety protocol? You can't. It deprives the president of the conflict he feeds on. This strategy exposes a fundamental misunderstanding in how this administration views power. The Trump doctrine assumes that economic power is about size, who has the biggest GDP, who buys the most stuff. And sure, size matters. But in the modern world, power is also about complexity. It is about integration. The North American economy is a web, not a hierarchy. When you try to tear that web to suit your own ends, you discover very quickly that you are tied to the people you are trying to hurt. We are seeing now that the Canadian strategy was likely war-gamed months in advance. They knew exactly which buttons to push. They looked at the map of the United States, they looked at the Electoral College, and they overlaid it with a map of agricultural exports. They found the exact counties, the exact districts where a drop in beef prices would cause maximum political damage to the Republican Party. This isn't just economics. It is election interference by other means. It is a foreign government using our own domestic supply chain to squeeze our political leadership. And the irony is thick enough to cut with a steak knife. For years, the America First movement has preached the importance of national sovereignty, of not letting other countries tell us what to do. They have argued that we should be able to set our own rules, protect our own borders, and prioritize our own industries. Well, Canada listened. They listened very closely. And now they are saying, you are absolutely right. We agree. We are putting Canada first. We are protecting our sovereignty. We are deciding what comes across our border. They are using the president's own rhetoric, his own logic, to justify a blockade of American goods. It is a mirror image that is leaving the White House paralyzed. They cannot complain about Canada putting their own interests first without admitting that the entire premise of their own foreign policy is flawed. They are trapped in a logic loop of their own creation. The consequences of this go far beyond the current news cycle. We are looking at a potential realignment of global agricultural trade. Markets are efficient. They hate a vacuum. If Canadian grocery stores cannot get American beef, they aren't going to just leave the shelves empty. They are going to call Brazil. They are going to call Australia. They are going to call the European Union. And once those supply lines are established, once those contracts are signed, they are incredibly sticky. It is very hard to dislodge an incumbent supplier. So we are risking a generational loss of market share. We are risking the possibility that 20 years from now, American ranchers will look back at this moment as the turning point, the moment when they lost their most reliable customer, because their government decided to pick a fight it couldn't win. We also have to consider the signal this sends to the rest of the world. If Canada, polite, friendly, neighborly Canada, can successfully stand up to the United States and inflict real pain, what does that tell China? What does that tell the European Union? It tells them that the American giant has a glass jaw. It tells them that the bluster is a mask for vulnerability. It tells them that if you target the president's political base, if you hit the farmers and the manufacturers in the swing states, the White House will freeze. The president's silence is being read in capitals around the world, not as restraint, but as shock. It is the silence of a bully who just got punched in the nose for the first time and doesn't know what to do next. The aura of invincibility is gone. And in geopolitics, once the aura is gone, the sharks start circling. We have to zoom out for a moment and look at the structural damage this is doing to the very concept of how we govern ourselves and how we interact with the world. For 70 years, the global economy, and specifically the American economy, was built on a foundation of predictability. It was built on the idea that if you follow the rules, if you meet the standards, if you sign the contract, the deal goes through. That stability is what allowed businesses to invest. It is what allowed farmers to plant next year's crop. It is what allowed the world to trust the American dollar and the American word. What we are seeing with this beef dispute and the frantic, paralyzed reaction from the White House is the disintegration of that predictability. We are seeing what happens when you replace the rule of law with the rule of the loudest voice. When policy is made by tweet or by sudden impulse, the machinery of the state starts to break down. Canada is not just rejecting beef, they are rejecting the chaos. They are rejecting the uncertainty that has become the hallmark of this administration's foreign policy. And in doing so, they are showing us that chaos has a price tag. It is easy to get lost in the abstraction of trade deficits and market shares, but we need to be very clear about who is actually paying that price. This is not a story about numbers on a screen. This is a story about the family in Nebraska that has been raising cattle on the same plot of land since the 1880s. They have weathered droughts. They have weathered floods. They have weathered market crashes. but they cannot weather a government that actively sabotages their access to the market. Think about what is happening at the kitchen tables in those farmhouses right now. These are people who did everything right. They followed the regulations. They invested in the technology to make their product the best in the world. They believed the promises that their government was going to fight for them, that the toughness they voted for was going to result in winning. And now they are looking at their herds, thousands of animals that represent their entire net worth, and they have nowhere to send them. The human toll of this is visceral. We are hearing stories of ranchers having to make the heartbreaking decision to cull their herds because they cannot afford to feed them if they cannot sell them. That is not just a financial loss. That is a spiritual blow to people who define themselves by their ability to feed the world. It is the destruction of a heritage. And it doesn't stop at the farm gate. When the rancher can't sell his cattle, he doesn't buy the new tractor. He doesn't fix the barn. He doesn't go into town to eat at the local diner. The ripple effect tears through these rural communities that are already hanging by a thread. The feed store lays off workers. The local bank sees loan defaults spike. The trucking companies that haul the beef park their rigs and stop hiring drivers. We are talking about the systematic hollowing out of the very communities that this administration claimed to be the champion of. And there is a profound sense of betrayal in this. Because this wasn't an act of nature. This wasn't a hurricane or a wildfire. This was a man-made disaster. It was a disaster manufactured in Washington, D.C. by people who have likely never set foot in a feedlot in their lives. The disconnect between the rhetoric of the White House, the winning, the greatest economy ever, and the reality on the ground in these communities is becoming a chasm. While the president fumes and stays silent, presumably trying to figure out how to spin this, real families are facing foreclosure. Real businesses are closing their doors. And they are realizing that in the high-stakes poker game of international trade, they were not the players. They were the chips. They were the ante that the president threw into the pot without a second thought. And now that the hand is lost, he is not the one who has to walk away from the table broke. This brings us to a critical realization about the nature of populism in this specific moment. Populism promises to protect the forgotten man from the elites, from the globalists, from the foreign powers. But what happens when the populist leader's own incompetence, his own belligerence, becomes the biggest threat to that forgotten man's livelihood? What happens when the protection actually leaves you more exposed, more vulnerable, and poorer? That is the question that is haunting the West Wing right now. They know that if the base figures this out, if the farmers and the truckers and the rural communities realize that the trade war is a scam that they are paying for, the whole political coalition collapses. That is why the beef rejection is so dangerous. It pierces the bubble. It shows that the emperor has no clothes, and worse, he has no buyers for his beef.